welcome to another one of our webinars on some of the changes that are constantly being made by the regulatory bodies, and Mitch will explain them. Our attempt will be now on a monthly basis to have a webinar on some issue from either the compliance side or the advocacy side. And this is just one of them. We have about 5 or 6 people that registered that are not here, but I think we should go. We're building the coalition. There's hopefully going to be a couple of live events that we're going to participate in over the next 4 to 6 months, and probably the next week or so we'll have some more information on the first one. I just don't want to jump the gun with that yet. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and our treasurer of the coalition, Bob Kovac.
Thank you very much, Mitch, because, I mean, we all know that this takes a lot of work, and the intellectual property that you put into it is extremely valuable. So having said that, then I'm going to turn my camera off, and Stuart, you can probably turn yours off. And again, if anybody has questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. Everybody has permission to talk.
I wanted to take a few minutes. This is not going to be a long webinar, but to talk about the revocation of consent rulemaking that the FCC finalized and published in February. It was subsequently published in the Federal Register in March. For the reason being that it's important, it's an important topic, it's important stuff, but mostly I find that there's a lot of confusion about whether it's in effect, what parts of it are in effect, what happens if I don't comply, are we subject to it, or are our text messages subject to it, what is CTIA's involvement with all of this? So I thought it would be a good idea to address some of these issues as a group, and we can go through what the requirements are in the rulemaking itself, and then we can talk at the end about what's in effect already, what is yet to be in effect, and like I said before, does any of it matter if CTIA is going to have their way anyway? So having said that, we'll talk, most of the rule has to do with the revocation of consent. Consent is a topic that comes up several times in the TCPA and in the FCC's rules implementing the TCPA. So let's start by discussing which consent are we talking about. The new regulations that went into effect, or that were published in February and March, refer to the consent, or deal with the consent that a calling party needs to obtain, or that a called party needs to give, either express consent, prior express consent, or prior express written consent. So we're talking about instances where you're sending a pre-recorded message. That's not a sales solicitation. That would be prior express consent. A pre-recorded message that is a sales solicitation. A voice call initiated with an automatic telephone dialing system to a cell phone, or a text message obviously initiated to a cell phone that's also initiated using an automatic telephone dialing system. So those are the contexts where we're talking about consent revocation. What's not included is do not call, national do not call, and company-specific do not call consents and revocations. The regulatory language contained in the FCC rules do not use the term consent, even when someone opts in to receive calls if the number's on a do not call list. The FCC's regulations in that context are prior express permission. It does not use the word consent. So again, we're talking about mostly pre-recorded messages to cell phones, for the most part, and voice calls initiated with an ATDS, and text messages initiated with an ATDS. So assuming that someone has opted in and has provided consent, the new rules provide further clarity about how to revoke that consent, how a called party can revoke that consent, and how the telemarketer or the calling party has to interpret attempts by the called party to revoke consent. It's important to keep in mind that a called party may use any reasonable method to revoke consent. A calling party cannot require certain avenues or certain methods, certain methodologies in order for a revocation of consent to be effective. A called party can use any reasonable method. Now, that's been the guidance, that's been the interpretation, and certainly the advice that I've been giving clients for the last 20 years. But for the first time, the FCC actually codified that and put that requirement in the rules itself. Next, the rules state that any automated interactive voice or key press activated mechanism must reference or must listen to and interpret 7 magic words to be revocation of consent. Stop, quit, end, revoke, opt out, cancel, and unsubscribe. Those are what I call the 7 magic words. So there are several instances where the calling party must use either a key press activated or an interactive voice mechanism. If you're using an interactive voice mechanism on a call, your equipment must be able to listen to and interpret and hear those 7 magic words. And once it's heard, implement or interpret that to be a do not call request.
Mitch, are you using, is any of this in the PowerPoint?
You don't see a PowerPoint. You telling me?
See your screen, but I don't see where you are if you're on a particular slide.
I've been turning on my screen.
There you go.
Ooh, that's weird. Okay. Let's go with this then.
Thank you.
All right. So there are the 7 magic words. Again, your platform must be able to listen to, interpret, and hear those words when spoken and interpret them to be an opt-out of receiving future ATDS calls that are transmitting a pre-recorded message, for example. Also, if you give a website or a telephone number designated to process revocations, then again, that website or telephone number must be able to interpret those words as well as being opt-out requests from the person that was called. Bob, as I advance the slide on my other screen, you see the next slide, slide?
Yep.
All right. The rules also address revocation of consent by text message. So if you're sending out a text message to your recipients, if the recipient replies to that text message with those same 7 magic words, then again, you must treat that as a revocation of consent. And again, those 7 words: stop, quit, end, revoke, opt out, cancel, or unsubscribe. But it's not just those 7 words. Other messages, phrases, words must be treated as a valid revocation if a reasonable person would understand those words to constitute a revocation of consent. So again, another instance where we have been counseling that for the last 20 years, but it is now has been inserted into the language of the rule itself. Remember, it's going to be a reasonable person standard. Don't let that fool you. It is not really a reasonable person. It's basically the just about any consumer out there. If they thought that what they were doing was going to effectuate a opt-out request, then it's going to be a very low standard, a very low bar, and companies are going to have to interpret that that request as an opt-out. In my practice, I see all the time clients asking me, do they need to interpret this request as an opt-out, that request as an opt-out? 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. You have to interpret those requests as opt-outs. What if your platform does not recognize or does not receive incoming reply texts? Well, the new rule addresses that as well. If the texting protocol does not allow the reply texts, then it's incumbent upon the texting platform, the caller in this context, to insert into the outbound message clear and conspicuous disclosure that two-way texting is not available due to that technical limitation. And that outbound message must provide, in clear and conspicuous language, alternative ways to revoke consent on each message. So you see you have significantly increased the length and the number of characters that you're using in that outbound message if your texting platform cannot accommodate and does not recognize reply texts. How long do you have to revoke to process an opt-out? Revocation requests in any reasonable manner must be honored within a quote-unquote reasonable time period. However, that reasonable time period may not exceed 10 business days from receipt of the request. Now, that's a significant change from the current law. The current law is a not to exceed 30 days. The FCC was considering making it immediate, but they settled in the final rule on providing 10 business days for companies to process opt-outs. Companies are not allowed to designate exclusive means where they will receive and honor requests. Again, it goes back to what we discussed a few slides earlier. Any reasonable attempt, any reasonable communication, wherever it is communicated to by the consumer to opt out of receiving future texts or robocalls, pre-recorded messages, must be honored. You cannot designate exclusive means to receive those requests. The use of any other means to revoke consent by a consumer to any telephone number or email address intended to reach the caller creates a rebuttable presumption that the consumer revoked consent. So the texting platform, the calling party, will be able to contest and challenge whether the transmission of the opt-out was done in a manner which a reasonable person would have expected it to be honored. But again, it is going to be, there is a rebuttable presumption in favor of the consumer. And I've litigated this before in federal court. Rebuttable presumption is very difficult to overcome. Ultimately, under the regulations, it's the totality of the circumstances that will determine whether the opt-out was done in a reasonable manner. But again, given that it's a rebuttable presumption, given that this is very much a pro-consumer statute and regulation, it will be an uphill battle to challenge any type of the effectiveness of any revocation of consent by a consumer. There's been a lot of discussion about one-time confirmation messages. It is very typical, maybe even standard in the texting industry, that when companies receive a opt-out, for them to immediately transmit a confirmation message. There was litigation about this probably a decade ago about whether that opt-out message itself is a violation of the TCPA. And the FCC ultimately determined that companies are able to send a one-time message confirming the revocation of consent. But keep in mind that opt-out message has several parameters around it. First, it can only contain the revocation, or it can only confirm the revocation request. Importantly, it cannot contain any type of marketing or promotional information itself. So, for example, you cannot say, "Hey, Bob, are you sure you want to opt out because Club Med has some fantastic vacation deals coming up in the month of June?" That would be a violation. It can only contain the confirmation. And that confirmation also can be the only additional message sent to Bob in this case, or the called party, after receiving the request. If Bob does not respond to that one-time confirmation, then you got to let it go and you treat it as a valid revocation. Also, that revocation text must be sent within 5 minutes of receipt of the, not the fall, of the call, for it to be permissible. If it takes more than 5 minutes, you must be able to demonstrate that that delay was reasonable. The longer the delay, the more difficult it will be to demonstrate that the delay was reasonable. And that will obviously lead to an increase in the likelihood of liability. Lastly, about one-time confirmation messages, if the recipient consented to several different categories of text messages, that confirmation message may request clarification as to whether the revocation was meant to encompass all such messages or all such categories or only particular types of categories of messages. It's incumbent to cease all further text messaging for which consent is otherwise required, absent the consumer's clarification that the recipient wishes to continue to receive certain types of messages. And again, that one-time confirmation message may only contain confirmatory language. You may not insert any type of promotional language when you are trying to determine if the consumer is opting out of all messages or only certain types of messages. And lastly, before we get into the effective dates and the confusion circuit about the effective dates, the new rules also address recording do not call requests or do not text requests. Companies must record requests and place the subscriber's name, if it's provided, and the telephone number on the DNC list at the same time the request is made. Now, that is a significant departure from the current rule, which only requires that the telephone number be memorialized on a do not call list. Now the name needs to be recorded as well. And again, must honor those requests, the do not call requests, within a reasonable amount of time. And just like in the context of text messages, do not call requests must be processed and adhered to within 10 business days from the date of receipt. There's liability on the sellers for the failure to honor do not call requests. That is similar to the existing rule. And again, you must obtain prior express permission if you're going to share a person's do not call requests with any third party other than the selling entity, the seller. So those are the substantive requirements of the new rules. Then we get into some of the confusion that has circulated about the effective date of the rules. The language that's on your screen is the actual language that comes out of the order. And as you see, it says first that the new rules are effective 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. Publication in the Federal Register took place in early March. But it says that certain sections which contain new or modified information or collection requirements will not be required until 6 months after the Office of Management and Budget completes review of any information collection requirements that the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau determines is required under the Paperwork Reduction Act. So that certainly is a mouthful. But what we're getting at, or what the FCC is getting at, is there's one requirement that goes into effect immediately. All the other new sections don't go into effect until 6 months after OMB completes a rule, which has to be after the FCC determines new requirements under the Paperwork Reduction Act, which the net of all of that is wait and see. We don't quite know yet when certain provision of the rules will go into effect. So let me break that down for you more specifically. The notice was published in the Federal Register on March 5th, 2024. The only requirement that is currently in effect are the requirements we discussed regarding the one-time text messages to confirm revocation, including the one-time messages to ask what type of text message are you actually seeking to opt out, or are you looking to opt out of all of our messages? Again, those went into effect April 4th of 2024. All the other requirements we went through, the effective date has been postponed. Those are the requirements that 10 business days is the minimum time frame, or the maximum time frame, I should say, to honor internal do not call requests and text message opt-outs. All those discussions we had about recognizing the 7 magic words, what constitutes reasonable means of revocation, all of that has been delayed. So you must be thinking, well, great. Then why are we here? What's the point if there's only one provision that went into effect? Well, a few things that I want to mention. First, it's just good business practice, perhaps, to implement those requirements anyway. As I mentioned, some of those requirements have been the law for the last 15 or 20 years, and we've been advising clients to interpret the law as such. Secondly, these requirements are coming down the road, so it may make sense for your company, for your brand, to implement those requests now, since they are coming down the road, if you consider that this is a pro-consumer regulation and you want to cater to the needs, wants, and desires of consumers. But then also consider that the CTIA requires many of these requirements anyway. The CTIA is the Cellular Telephone Industries Association. It's a very powerful industry association of the wireless carriers, and they have their own set of guidelines, which are voluntary, but a lot of those voluntary requirements are addressed in these regulations, or a lot of those requirements which were voluntary before and are now subject to these regulations are contained in the CTIA guidelines. And what happens if you violate a CTIA guideline? Again, it's not a law. You won't be in trouble with the CTIA, but you will be in trouble with those cellular telephone companies that are members of the CTIA. And what can they do? Well, what they will do is that they would send notices to the retail consumer cellular telephone carriers, think Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, to block calls that do not comply, or I should say to block messages that do not comply with the CTIA requirements. The last thing I want to mention is what you should consider also is, does any of this matter if your messages are not subject to the TCPA? And why would your text messages not be subject to the TCPA? Well, that's because they are not initiated with an automatic telephone dialing system. After the Facebook decision, it has been the case that most texting platforms are outside of the definition of TCPA. Of automatic telephone dialing system, and therefore outside of the scope of the TCPA and the FCC's regulations. But again, the CTIA requirements are agnostic to whether you're subject to the TCPA or not. And if you are not complying with the CTIA guidelines, your messages are subject to being blocked by the downstream carriers. So that's all I have in terms of prepared comments. Bob, I'll send it back to you and see if there's any questions from our attendees.
Okay. Anybody? Come on in. Isaac, you got something to say.
You know, Mitch did a fantastic job, and I think there's a lot of points that I hope people were really zeroing in on, like things like the consent on the do not call list. You know, there are petitions to extend the consent revocation, or to, I'm doing air quotes here, clarify that applies to the DNC list. But you know, as Mitch very rightfully said, I think it's a poor argument, and I don't think anybody with authority currently interprets it as reading as such. And the ATDS comment, also incredibly important when it comes to text messages. I'm not aware of any text case that was set as pre-recorded voice, because I guess that's technically the other TCPA, big TCPA limitation, but I haven't seen much success around that. But this is where too, and I think Mitch brought something on this, the last one was with the Do Not Disturb Act that's out there. If that passes, that could be a complete game changer under the TCPA. So I think this is where it's just important to be working with ECAC on trying to affect meaning changes in our laws.
Thank you. Anybody? Questions, comments? Stuart, you want to wrap it up?
Mitch did a good job. Usually there's questions.
Hey, and this technology is getting better.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the ECAC is important because these regulations are not stopping. Well, we think sometimes we're past the telemarketing regulation. We're not. As Isaac brought up, the Do Not Disturb Act basically could put the industry out of business, actually. Many people wouldn't be able to make outbound calls. So we're on top of that, and we'll be going to DC as often as possible to literally, and one of these live events may include the author of that bill. So stay tuned on that. Otherwise, Mitch, if you have anything to close, or Bob?
Well, in
Anybody
addition, I just want to point out that right now, privacy law is getting passed in states all the time. Texas being the latest, and they want to be, the strictest country. And so one of the areas and cornerstones that the ECAC is focused on is trying to get Congress to move toward one bill. We all learned, I think, through Do Not Call, that when we had to deal with 50 pieces of legislation in 50 different states, it was expensive, it was onerous, it was harmful to the industry. So we want to be mindful with the privacy legislation, which is another reason the ECAC is important. So having said that, Stuart, thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.